Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game. Today I'm going to be talking about my TGT Budget Warrior deck. This is a budget deck that has a control style slant to it. It's all about the late game, which is kind of hard to do when you're playing in a budget environment, but I still think it's unfair that newer players don't get a chance to play control style decks, so I wanted to build one as affordably as I could. Now keep in mind this deck is not for you if you're a longtime player and you have a fair number of cards in your collection. This deck is designed for people who are brand new to the game, don't have very many cards, and don't have very much dust to craft new ones. So that said, this deck has a 600 arcane dust limit imposed upon it. I wanted to build a deck in 600 dust. That's very hard to do for a control style deck, but I think we ended up with something that's really pretty good. I've been testing this deck out on the ladder, and though it certainly won't carry you to Legend, I do think it's capable of rank 15, maybe even rank 12 or rank 10 if you're very skilled and patient or make just a few select card upgrades. So, the general idea with this deck is to survive into the late game, and then you have quite a few late game oriented minions that are very good at sticking on the board and stacking up damage on your enemy's face. So you want to survive in the early game, start to stabilize in the mid game, and then in the late game just continue to drop big minion threats that your opponent can't answer, and then just push them over for lethal damage. And you have a few different ways to answer threats and remove minions that they play, so that should be pretty favorable for you in the late game, unless you're running into top tier meta decks, which is why this deck really can't survive past rank 10, possibly even past rank 15. So, now that you know kind of the idea of this deck, I think it's just helpful to run through every single card on the list and give them each just a minute or so of discussion so that you understand exactly what they're meant to do. Up first is Execute. This is a 1-mana spell. Anytime an enemy minion has taken damage, you can use this to kill it. So in other words, it's kind of the great equalizer card. It's in the basic set for warriors. It's totally free for you. And you can kill any minion in the game with this card, no matter how big or scary it might be, as long as it has taken damage. It's a pretty fantastic removal. Up next is Whirlwind. This is a 1-mana spell that does 1 damage to all minions. That means enemy minions and your own minions. Now you might see some natural synergies between Whirlwind and Execute. That's certainly true. For 2 mana, you can kill just about any single minion that's in your way. Whirlwind is also good in the meta right now just because there are so many 1/1 minions in the game, whether it's paladins with Silverhand recruits or demons from warlocks. There are a number of different classes that utilize 1 health minions, so Whirlwind can be a pretty good early game clear if you happen to see a few of those on the enemy side of the board. Up next is Fiery War Axe. This 2-mana weapon is really kind of the best anti-aggro card in the game. It allows you to kill just about anything your opponent can play in the first 2 turns, ensuring that you don't fall behind on the board too early and never recover. So it's probably your best card to have in your opening hand. It can just do so many things. It's really even good in the late game because you can chip down enemy minions' health or use it for damage against the enemy's face. After that is the 2-mana Cruel Taskmaster. This is a 2/2 minion with a pretty neat battle cry. It does 1 damage to a minion and gives that minion +2 attack. So sometimes you can use this on your own minions to give them a little extra damage boost, maybe to trade up efficiently, or just do extra damage to the enemy's face. But since that 1 damage can be used on enemy minions as well, sometimes it's good to just ping off a big threat that only has 1 health left, or clear one of those early game 1/1s that we talked about with Whirlwind. So, Cruel Taskmaster can do a couple of interesting different things. It's also good for a combo that I've snuck into this deck that we'll talk about a little later. After that is a new card from the Grand Tournament. This is Bash, a 3-mana spell. It does 3 damage to anything, minions or the enemy face, and it gives you 3 armor in the process. So this is a pretty cool early game defensive card that not only increases your health but also helps you clear off some nasty stuff. It's great against things like piloted shredders, but it can be used really just about anything. And It's one of the early game defensive cards that allows you to survive to the point at which you can stabilize in the late game. Up next is a very interesting addition to this deck, and not something that most people would expect to see, but it is a free card, and it's the 3-mana Charge. This gives a friendly minion +2 attack and charge. So one thing that a budget control warrior really lacks is a late game finishing option. So normal control warriors will have something like Alexstrasza, a legendary dragon that essentially does 15 damage to the enemy's face by reducing their health to 15. Or Gromash Hellscream, which is another legendary minion, but one that can charge for 10 damage, essentially. And since those are both legendaries and don't quite fit into our Arcane Dust limit, I've created a couple alternate options, basically using the card Charge. Since this can give any minion in your deck charge, and that 2 attack bonus, you can kind of piece together a 9 damage charge, or a 7 damage charge, a few different kind of rush damage options that will allow you to finish off games surprisingly often. Without this card, sometimes this deck can kind of just flounder in the late game and never quite get the kill that it needs. So, Charge is an interesting inclusion, but a powerful one, nonetheless. After that is Shield Block. This is a 3-mana spell that gives you 5 armor and draws a card. Armor is fantastic in an aggressive meta, just helps you survive a little longer. And you do need to draw through your cards, so having an extra card draw option is pretty fantastic. On that note, the 3-mana Acolyte of Pain is next up. This is only a 1/3 minion, which doesn't sound too exciting on its own. But anytime it takes damage, you draw a card. And card advantage is something you always want to have in a control deck. It's nice to have options so that you can ensure removal and that you have a nice minion to play. And Acolyte of Pain gives you that. Now, just playing Acolyte of Pain as a naked 3-mana minion is usually not very good because your opponent can kill it in one fell swoop and you only draw 1 card, but you can combo it with things like Cruel Taskmaster. In other words, you can play Acolyte of Pain, ping it with your Cruel Taskmaster Battlecry. That turns Acolyte of Pain into a 3/2, which is a little bit scarier, but also draws it an extra guaranteed card. You can also use it with Whirlwind to draw cards. So a nice turn, if you're really desperate for cards, might be dropping Acolyte of Pain, following up with Whirlwind, and then finally using Cruel Taskmaster. That'll draw you 2 cards and give you a couple nice little minions as well. After that is Piloted Shredder. This is kind of the ultimate value minion in Hearthstone at the 4-mana slot. It's just so very good. It has a great board presence. It's sticky, it's hard to deal with, it trades up well. And although it's not something you'd normally necessarily see in a control deck, it's just a great overall minion and it's very affordable to craft. So it's hard to make a budget deck and not put Piloted Shredder in there. After that is the 4-mana Sinjin Shieldmaster. This is a 3/5 with Taunt. It's really kind of the go-to mid-range basic card. This is probably one of the best basic cards in the game. It's just got a good little nice value body. The Taunt is good when you're trying to slow down aggressive decks at the 4-mana slot. So if you coin it out on turn 3, even if you play it on curve on turn 4, it's usually difficult for your opponent to deal with it at that point. It can also be a nice save in the late game if you need to preserve some life or slow down at lethal push. So Sinjin Shieldmaster can do a couple different things pretty well. We have another 4-mana minion after this. That's Spellbreaker. This is a 4/3 again, but this time its Battlecry silences a minion. Now normally you'll see the Ironbeak Owl used as the silence in a control deck, but we need some bodies and some threats in this particular deck list. And Spellbreaker's 4/3 body is more significant than Ironbeak Owl's 2/1, which is so easily removed. So this kind of serves as not only a silence, but an extra minion you can throw down on the board at certain points. So don't underestimate the value of just having another 4-attack minion around. That can add up and be significant. And even though it costs 2 additional mana, usually you're going to need those silences later in the game when you have a little bit more mana flexibility. So Spellbreaker fits pretty well. After that is Arcanite Reaper. This is a 5-mana 5/2 weapon. It's a free card, so that's always nice. Normally you'll see Death Spite in Control Warrior lists, but that is a card only available in the Naxxramas adventure, and since Naxxramas can be pretty cost prohibitive, and you can't actually craft an individual card from Naxxramas, Arcanite Reaper takes this spot instead. But honestly, Arcanite Reaper has some advantages anyway. There are a plethora of 5 health minions in the game that are very powerful, such as Emperor Thaurissan or Sylvanas Windrunner, and Arcanite Reaper is able to clear those much more easily than Deathspite. It lacks the advantage of the Whirlwind effect, which can be very, very nice, but Arcanite Reaper actually has advantages of its own. Plus, it can just be 10 damage to the enemy's face if you need it, so that's a nice bonus too. After that, we have Gurubashi Berserker. This is a 2/7 minion, which doesn't sound all that exciting for 5 mana, but whenever it takes any kind of damage, it gains 3 attack. So much like Acolyte of Pain, we like it when Acolyte of Pain takes damage, we also like it when Gurubashi Berserker takes damage. It can become a very threatening minion very, very quickly. So with a Cruel Taskmaster, for instance, it becomes a 7/6 minion very quickly, and if you add in a charge for that, that means you can make it a 9/6 charging minion for 3 cards and 10 mana. So it's really not all that different than the famed Grommash Hellscream, which does 12 damage for 10 mana. So you can still put together some interesting burst damage thanks to Gurubashi Berserker. It's also kind of just a strong play on turn 5. It's not a card that a lot of opponents are used to seeing, and they might have a little bit of trouble dealing with it. And you can get surprising value out of this thing, even though it's a basic card and a free card. After that is another late game minion, because remember this is a control deck, so we're not only trying to control the enemy's board, but we're plopping down threats in the late game as well. The first of which was Gurubashi Berserker. We've also got the 6 mana Boulder Fist Ogre. This is about as vanilla as a card gets. It's just a big, annoying body as a 6/7 minion. It's not susceptible to Big Game Hunter, but it trades very effectively with the metagame. It might just be a basic free card with no card text, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It's still quite strong. And it's so unusual, and the stats are so favorable that you'll be surprised how often Boulder Fist Ogre is a very good late game minion. Similarly, a new card with the Grand Tournament that exists in this deck for the very same reason that Boulder Fist Ogre does is the Captured Jormungandr. This is a 5/9 for 7 mana, but even though you're losing that 1 attack from the Boulder Fist Ogre, 5 attack is generally all you're going to need on a minion anyway. 5 attack trades with everything and still adds up damage on the enemy face as needed, but that 9 health is even more difficult for opponents to remove. It's not susceptible to Big Game Hunter. 9 health does not trade easily for anyone. It doesn't die to a fireball ping from a mage, for instance. There's a good chance your Captured Jormungandr will survive for multiple turns when you play it, and that's exactly what you need for your late game bodies in a control deck. And finally, the last card in this list is a really strong card for a common quality 9 mana card. This is from the Grand Tournament, brand new card that really gave budget control decks exactly what they needed as a late game value card. The 9 mana North Sea Kraken is a 9/7 minion, which is just insanely huge. It is susceptible to Big Game Hunter, and the 7 health isn't particularly awesome for 9 mana, but still, if it does stick on the board for any length at all, you're going to get extreme value out of that body. But more importantly is the battle cry, deal 4 damage. That is an extremely strong tempo battle cry if you can kill a minion off on the enemy board using that 4 damage. It's also just good to hit the enemy face sometimes for 4 damage when you need it and establish a giant threat if you're ahead on the board. So North Sea Kraken can do a lot of things, and it's kind of the perfect late game threat and board response that has an active effect on the game immediately when it's played, which is what you need for 9 mana. So that's every card in this list, all 30 cards. Now that you know how each card works and the general strategy, let's talk about mulligans. It's very difficult to mulligan with a deck like this because you really don't have very many early game options, and you can't lose in the early game or obviously you're done for. The whole design of this deck is to stabilize in the mid game and win late. So you have to survive that early game in decent shape or you won't have a chance. So what should you be looking for in the mulligan? It's really pretty simple. it's your cheap cards. Fiery War Axe is the #1 priority no matter what. If you see a Fiery War Axe in your opening hand, you should absolutely always keep it. No matter the class, no matter the matchup, Fiery War Axe is the perfect answer. You should also aim to keep your Cruel Taskmasters. Even though these have some late game value, they're one of your only early game minions. You'll notice the next minion on the list is Acolyte of Pain for 3 mana. So it's good to have that 2 mana minion. It can ping off a Divine Shield sometimes, set up a Fiery War Axe clear. It can kill 1/1 minions that are in the way. It just serves as a 2/2 body to trade onto the board. It's a good card to have around in the early game. Your next best card is Whirlwind. It's not always going to be good, but if the enemy class is something that might have 1 health minions like a Hunter or a Paladin or a Warlock, Whirlwind will generally gain value in the first few turns. After that, you also should keep Bash. Even though it's 3 mana and you won't get to use it immediately, you don't want to get stuck with a hand that's like Boulderfist Ogre, Arcanite Reaper, Northsea Kraken, Spellbreaker. It would be an extremely weak opening hand. So if you see a Bash, don't toss it back, save it. It might be the lifeline that gives you a little extra health and gets rid of that scary minion on turn 3. You don't want to see a charge. You probably don't want to see an execute or a shield block. Sinjin Shieldmaster, if you have absolutely nothing else in your early game in that opening hand, but you've got a Sinjin Shieldmaster, it might be a good idea to keep it, just so that you know if all else fails and you don't draw into your Fiery War Axe or that Bash, that you can rely on that Sinjin Shieldmaster on turn 4. It's like your last resort fallback card. If you have any of these other things, keeping the Sinjin Shieldmaster would be fine too, just so that you know you can curve out smoothly as the mid game comes along. So that's what I recommend for mulligans. You'll learn it as you get used to certain meta matchups, what feels better and what gives you the best results, but that should be a good strong foundation for you. Now, as a new player, I know one thing I like to hear is replacements, upgrades. Where do I go with this deck next? You gave me a cool little foundation of cards, but how can I improve upon that and get better and refine this deck? So, I have a few specific recommendations on that note. First up is an epic card, which is unfortunately only 1 mana, Shield Slam. Deal 1 damage to a minion for each armor that you have. This, much like Execute, is an extremely efficient removal spell. Warriors are very good at building armor. This allows you to translate it into a minion removal. That's fantastic for a control deck that wants to keep the enemy board in check. The problem is, this is an epic quality card that's extremely expensive at 400 dust. It's almost more than the entire deck. So, as good as this is in Control Warrior, it's ran in almost every Control Warrior deck. You'll eventually need it if you want to be a full-time Control Warrior player. It's still hard to recommend it right off the bat. Just keep this in mind for maybe 3 months down the line when you have some extra dust and you really want to put the finishing touches on your deck. This is a fantastic card to have. It's just so cost prohibitive that the results might not be worth it right off the bat. Up next is a card that you can look for a little bit sooner, and that is the 2 mana Armor Smith. It's a rare quality, meaning it costs 100 dust to craft. It's just a 1/4, but it has a really, really cool effect. Whenever a friendly minion takes damage, gain 1 armor. So all the ways we can do damage to our own minions, like Whirlwind or Cruel Taskmaster, each time that happens, this card will give you an extra armor. It's also just another good early game minion that can trade into 1 health minions very efficiently with a side benefit, so it's really good to have in the early game. If you're going to craft a card, this might be the first one to add onto this list. It gives you extra early game survivability, has some late game utility sometimes too, and it's not that expensive. So keep an eye on Armor Smith. Another cool card that you can craft from Goblins vs. Gnomes is the 6 mana Shield Maiden. This is a 5/5 body, which is very reasonable for 6 mana. Has an awesome battle cry that just simply gives you 5 extra armor. So it's a really good defensive card, but it's also a nice body that trades into the board effectively most of the time. So you can take out a Boulderfist Ogre or a Gurubashi Berserker and slot in a Shield Maiden here. to make yourself even better at recovering in the mid to late game and closing out those games that were scaring you because your health total was getting incredibly low. And then, of course, when it comes to control warriors, really what you should do if you want to build a super refined, incredibly powerful control warrior deck is look towards legendary cards like Dr. Boom or Baron Geddon, or let's see, Emperor Thaurissan, Sylvanas. You can see there are quite a few legendaries that fit your needs. Ragnaros, Alexstrasza, and as we mentioned before, Grommash Hellscream. All fantastic legendaries that can carve out a spot in the Control Warrior list. Of course, if you're a new player, it might take you quite a long time to accrue all those legendaries. So if you're really desperate to play Warrior, it's worth it in the long run. Control Warrior is definitely one of the most consistent and strongest classes that there's ever been on the meta. It's been around for years, and it seems to be persisting still. So it's good to have goals, and those cards can all be goals that I hope you open in packs or you accrue enough dust to craft those eventually. But don't aim for just one legendary right now. Look for those Shield Maidens and those Armor Smiths and a few select replacements first, and then start moving towards the legendaries to fill out your deck. So you got some replacement and upgrade ideas. You've heard the Mulligan's card by card discussion and general strategy. I think that means that you're ready to take the TGT Budget Warrior out onto the ladder and see how it does. I think you'll have fun with this deck. It's really neat to drop big threats in the late game. You got some cool removal options, some fun cards. I wish you luck out there on the ladder. I appreciate all your time. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.